History is usually a story told about the big names, the emperors, the generals, the beautiful consorts. We remember the ones who changed the world. But what about the people who were never meant to have a story at all? The ones who lived and died in the shadows of power, whose names were almost completely erased. Nowhere is this more true than inside the Imperial Palace of China's Han Dynasty. It was a city within a city, home to a population of thousands of palace maids whose lives were dedicated to the endless, intricate needs of the imperial court. So what happened to these palace maids? Did they just fade into the background, living out their quiet, lonely lives? Well, not entirely. While most palace maids were forgotten, the stories of a few have survived. And they are absolutely incredible. In the unbelievable lottery of palace life, some of these women found a way out. One went from being a nameless maid to becoming one of the most powerful empresses in Chinese history. And another became the ancestor of a whole new dynasty, all because of a drunken accident. Talk about a turn of events. But for the vast majority who couldn't count on a miracle, survival meant something else entirely. It meant turning to each other. It meant they had to create their own families, finding one person in that massive crowd to partner with, and forming their own secret marriages right under the nose of the court. Hey everyone, I'm Amy. Today we're going to explore the lives and stories of the palace maids of the Han Dynasty. Let's look at the legends, the hidden world of their marriages to each other, and the web of relationships they built just to hold on to their humanity. The journey to becoming a palace maid began with an inspection. Imagine a 13-year-old girl in a quiet village, standing perfectly still while a government official looked her over. He wasn't just looking at her face, he was examining her entire family history. While this practice varied over the centuries, by the time of the Eastern Han Dynasty, the recruitment of palace maids had become a mostly regular event. A quiet panic would ripple through the villages surrounding the capital of Luoyang, often around the 8th month of the lunar calendar, a time tied to the annual government census. This was the time for the palace maid selection. Imperial officials, sometimes accompanied by fortune tellers who claimed they could read a person's destiny in their face, would fan out across the countryside. They weren't looking for the daughters of dukes or generals. They were searching for liangjiazi, the daughters of good families. So what exactly was a liangjiazi? Well, the court had a surprisingly specific checklist. First, you had to be a commoner. The government actually wanted to avoid bringing in girls from powerful, scheming noble families. Second, your family had to have a clean record. And third, your father couldn't work in a lowly profession. This meant no merchants and no artisans. It is probably surprising to us today, but in ancient China, these professions were looked down upon. The palace wanted girls from simple farming or minor official families, girls who were seen as pure, obedient, and most importantly, unconnected. For a girl between the ages of 13 and 20, a single nod from one of these officials were a life sentence dressed up as an honor. And this was not a voluntary audition. For the families in the regions targeted by the court, especially the areas around the capital of Luoyang, this was a mandatory duty. Every household that fit the liangjiazi profile was required by law to present their eligible daughters for inspection. Trying to hide a daughter was a serious crime. The historical records state the punishment was the same as for harboring a fugitive from the law. Unlike the intense multi-day pageant-like inspections of later dynasties, the Han selection process was a bit more straightforward, but no less terrifying. A girl would be presented, her family history checked, her features examined by the fortune tellers for auspicious signs. If she was chosen, there was no going back. Her family might feel a surge of pride, but it was overshadowed by the crushing reality that they were saying goodbye to their daughter forever. She was now imperial property. However, besides the standard process of conscription from Liangjiazi, palace maid positions were also sometimes filled by backgrounds of tragedy. Slaves, prisoners of war, and even women of disgraced and imprisoned noble families. Upon entering the palace gates, she wasn't alone. She was just one of thousands. By the reign of Emperor Huan in the eastern Han Dynasty, the palace housed 5,000 to 6,000 palace maids. Imagine the entire population of a small town living behind a single set of walls. Her old life was over. All contact with home was severed. Her name was recorded, then promptly forgotten, replaced by a title or simply lost in the sea of thousands of other faces. Her new reality was a world of endless, exhausting work. She would be sent to the Imperial Weaving Workshop, a massive factory-like hall where the thunderous clack of looms were the constant soundtrack to her long and punishing workday. Or she could be a personal attendant, a silent, obedient shadow to a high-ranking consort, where one wrong move could mean a brutal punishment. In this cutthroat world, there was a strict hierarchy. A newcomer was at the absolute bottom, at the mercy of senior maids who had survived for decades and enforced the rules with an iron fist. But beyond this informal pecking order, there was a more official career ladder, with two very different paths to the top. The first was the career path. A maid who was exceptionally skilled, intelligent, and loyal might, after many years, be promoted to the rank of a female official. This was a true promotion. She would go from being a laborer to a manager, overseeing a department or a group of junior maids. It was a position of real authority, offering better living conditions and a measure of respect. But it was incredibly rare. The second, and far more famous path, was the lottery path. This was the impossible dream. This wasn't a promotion, it was a miracle. It was the moment when the emperor, by some small chance, would notice a maid and elevate her to the status of a consort. This meant jumping from the servant class to the master class in an instant. It was the fantasy that fueled the ambitions and jealousies of the entire palace. So, was this a life sentence? Not always, but the alternatives was hardly a happy ending. There wasn't a single, fair rule that applied to everyone. In the Han Dynasty, a policy sometimes existed to release palace maids once they reached a certain age, around 25 or 30. But who actually got to leave often came down to luck and circumstances. An emperor might release a batch of maids to show his benevolence, only for his successor to keep everyone locked away. More importantly, it depended on what you knew. A low-level cleaner might be on the list for release, but a personal attendant to the empress, a woman who knew the court's most intimate and dangerous secrets, she was a walking liability. For her, there was no retirement. Her knowledge made her a prisoner for life. But even retirement was a terrifying prospect. After spending her youth locked away, a released maid was sent back into a world she no longer knew. In a time where girls married in their teens, she would already be considered too old. She had no practical skills for life outside the palace and was often plagued by chronic illness from the years of stress and confinement. And this grim freedom was the best-case scenario for many. The alternative was to simply be forgotten, destined to become a white-haired palace maid, who would live out her final days and die within the very walls that had claimed her entire life. But the endless work and the soul-crushing anonymity were only the beginning. The real dangers of the Han Palace were far more personal and far more terrifying. To understand the real dangers of the Han Dynasty palace, we have to start with one brutal fact. Unlike in the later Qing dynasty, where palace maids were strictly servants, in the Han Dynasty court, every single maid was considered the emperor's property, a part of his extended harem. This meant that at any moment, for any reason, she could be summoned to his bed. Her body was not her own. This disturbing reality is likely where the most shocking piece of folklore about Han Dynasty palace maids comes from. Many popular stories claim that palace maids were required to wear a special kind of open crotch pants. The supposed reason? To make them instantly and conveniently available to the emperor. While there is not any historical evidence to support this, these stories tells us everything we need to know about the constant sexual anxiety and vulnerability that defined their lives. And while the story of open crotch pants might be an exaggeration, the exploitation of palace maids was terrifyingly real. To see just how bad it could get, we only need to look at the reign of one of the most infamous emperors of the Eastern Han Dynasty, Emperor Ling. According to some accounts, he built a structure in his private gardens called the Naked Swimming Pavilion, where he would order his maids to swim naked in water for his amusement. He would even have some maids sail around in boats, only to unexpectedly overturn them, to watch the maids struggle in water. It was like his maids were his pets, or maybe even less than his pets, simply objects for his entertainment. Another of his famous projects was the flowing fragrance canal. Emperor Ling ordered selected palace maids to bathe in a perfumed bath filled with expensive spices and herbs. But this wasn't for their comfort. The used bathwater was collected and then channeled into a specially constructed stream that flowed through his private gardens. He would then walk along the banks of this canal filled with the second-hand bathwater of his maids and enjoy its fragrance. In addition to these accounts, other sensationalist texts took the stories of his depravity even further. For example, a famously shocking rumor found in the text called the Ancient and Modern Sea of Passion even claimed that Emperor Ling would force palace maids to copulate with dogs in his garden for his entertainment. While probably untrue, the fact that people could even imagine and write down such a rumor shows the kind of terrible reputation that the Han Dynasty palace had regarding the life of palace maids. But the emperor wasn't the only threat. For most maids, the more immediate danger often came from the powerful women they served. The inner court was a nest of jealousy and political intrigue, and the maids were the most vulnerable targets. Imagine being a loyal attendant to the gentle Empress Song. One day, her rivals and powerful eunuchs decide to get rid of her. They accuse her of using witchcraft to curse the emperor. Suddenly, your mistress is arrested, and instantly, you and every maid who works for her are now suspects in a capital crime. You could be dragged away, tortured, and forced to confess to anything. Your life destroyed in a political game you had nothing to do with. Even serving a powerful and jealous mistress was a death sentence. When a notoriously ruthless Empress He decided to murder her beautiful rival Lady Wang, how do you think it was done? Historical records suggest that she was poisoned. Who had to deliver the poison medicine? Who had to clean up the aftermath and keep their mouth shut, knowing that one wrong word could make them the next victim? The maids were the hands that were forced to do the dirty work, the silent witnesses who could be disposed of at any time, caught between the lust of the men and the jealousy of the women. A palace maid's life was lived on a knife's edge. The story of a palace maid was supposed to be a dead end, a story of peril and anonymity where the best he could hope for was to be forgotten. But every now and then, the brutal rules of the system would break, creating a legend that was whispered in the palace halls for centuries. This is that legend, the ultimate rags to riches fairy tale, a one-in-a-million shot that became the secret dream of every woman serving in the inner court. It's the story of a girl who, through an incredible twist of fate, went from being a nameless palace maid to one of the most powerful empresses in Chinese history. Her name is Fáng. Interestingly, the records of the Grand Historian and the Book of Han do not actually record her personal name and simply refer to her family name of Dòu. But later historical accounts mention that her name was Fáng, leading to the name that many of us know her by today. Within the early years of Han Dynasty, she began her career as a palace maid serving the powerful Empress Dowager Lü. After years of service, an opportunity arose. Around 185 BCE, the Empress Dowager decided to send a number of her maids out of the palace to be given as gifts to the rulers of feudal states. For Lady Dòu, this wasn't a punishment, it was a chance to go home. Her homestay was Zhao, and she desperately wanted to be sent there. So she scrapped together all her meager savings and gave them to the eunuch in charge of the assignments, begging him to put her on the list of Zhao. As the story goes, the eunuch took the bribe. But then, in a moment of carelessness, or perhaps he just forgot, he put her name on the wrong list. Instead of the familiar and prosperous kingdom of Zhao, he assigned her to the poor and remote northern kingdom of Dai. For Lady Dòu, this was a disaster. She wept, protesting that it was a mistake. But the imperial order was sealed, and she was forced to go. But the path that seemed like a catastrophe was actually her destiny. In the quiet court of Dai, she caught the eye of its virtuous and thoughtful king, Liu Hen. Liu Hen was the son of Liu Bang, the founder of the Han Dynasty. But he was not favored because he was born to a low-ranking consort, and he was sent to the remote and undesirable kingdom of Dai. In the humble environment of the quiet kingdom of Dai, Liu Hen may have found Lady Dòu to be a welcome change from the typical court lady. She was a girl from a poor family who understood hardship, not a schemer from a powerful clan. He himself was the son of a low-ranking consort, pushed to the margins of the empire. In Lady Dòu, he likely saw a kindred spirit, someone with a quiet strength that he came to admire and love. She soon became his favorite concubine. Then, in a tragedy that worked out in Lady Dòu's favor, the king's official queen fell ill and died, and Lady Dòu became the most powerful woman of his harem. Shortly after, all of the late queen's sons also passed away, leaving Lady Dòu's own children as the king's only heirs. Was Lady Dòu just lucky? The timing of events certainly gave her the biggest advantage. Many modern stories and folklores likes to suggest that Lady Dòu planned these tragedies in order to gain power. But it is important to know that there is no historical evidence of any foul play. So maybe it was just her time to shine after all. Then, in the year 180 BCE, a political earthquake shook the capital. The powerful Empress Dowager Lü died, and the court ministers violently purged her entire family from power. They needed a new emperor, and fast. But they wanted someone they could control, someone without a powerful mother or ambitious family members who would try to take over. Turns out that Liu Hen, the isolated king from the remote land of Dai, checked all of the boxes. Lady Dòu, the girl who had left the palace years ago as a nameless piece of property, now rode back through its gates in a royal carriage beside the new emperor of the Han Dynasty. She wasn't a maid anymore. She was the empress, the mother of the empire. According to historical records, like the records of the Grand Historian, she was a wise and benevolent empress. She is remembered for supporting many policies that brought peace and prosperity to the Han Dynasty. Her story is the ultimate proof that in a brutal game of the palace, the path you thought was a disaster might just be the one leading straight to the dragon throne. If Lady Dòu's story was the ultimate fairy tale, Our next story is a sharp reminder that a trip to the emperor's bed didn't always come with a happy ending. This isn't a story about destiny or a brilliant twist of fate. It's a story about pure dumb luck, and how even winning in a palace could feel a lot like being a pawn in someone else's game. This is the story of a maid known to history only as Lady Tang. The story begins around 156 BCE during the reign of Emperor Jing, the son of our fairy tale empress Lady Dòu. One evening, he unexpectedly decided to summon one of his less favored consort, a woman named Lady Chen. For a consort who had been ignored for a long time, this was the chance of a lifetime to win back favor. But there was just one problem. Lady Chen was having her period. To refuse the emperor was unthinkable, but to receive him was impossible. It was a terrifying, career-ending dilemma. Lady Chen came up with a risky plan. She called for her personal attendant, a young palace maid named Tang. After the emperor arrived, Lady Chen made sure his wine cup was never empty. Once he was thoroughly drunk and stumbling toward the bedchamber, she pushed her terrified maid Tang into the darkened room in her place. The emperor, in his intoxicated state, never noticed the switch. Lady Chen hoped the incident would be swept under the rug. But the next morning, the emperor realized he'd been tricked. He was furious, but he was also embarrassed. To punish Lady Chen and the maid would be to publicly admit he was fooled. So he decided to let it go. But then, weeks later, the impossible happened. The maid, Tang, was pregnant. Now, the emperor had no choice. He couldn't deny his own child. He gave Tang the minor title of Lady Tang, but she was never truly a favored consort. She and her son, Liu Fa, became the living symbols of an imperial mistake. They had royal status, but no power and no respect. When the prince grew up, he was quickly married off and sent away to a poor and remote region of the empire, Changsha. And that should have been the end of their story, a minor, embarrassing footnote in the imperial records. But history has a funny way of playing the long game. Many years later, the Western Han Dynasty collapsed in a civil war. But one man who would rise from the chaos and restore the Han Empire for another 200 years by establishing the Eastern Han Dynasty. This man was the brilliant general named Liu Xiu. And it turns out, Liu Xiu was a descendant of the cast-aside and forgotten palace maid, Lady Tang. In one of China's greatest ironies, the continuity of the Han Dynasty was saved by a desperate moment. This is the story of how a drunken emperor, a clever deception, and a terrified palace maid's personal tragedy became the empire's salvation. The stories of Lady Dòu and Lady Tang are the stories of miracles and accidents. They are the incredible lottery-winning exceptions. But what about the thousands of other women who never caught the eye of the emperor and who never stumbled into history? For them, survival wasn't about getting out of the palace. It was about finding a way to live inside it. Since they couldn't have a real family, they created their own. They formed secret, loving partnerships that came to be known by a simple, everyday name, 对视. The term literally means opposite eating, as in two people sharing a meal face to face. It sounds mundane, but in the paranoid environment of the imperial court, where you couldn't be sure who was a friend or a spy, the act of regularly and openly sharing food was the ultimate sign of trust. This simple phrase became the name for a bond that went far deeper than just friendship and meant sharing a life. 对视 was a conscious imitation of marriage between two palace maids. This was a solution born out of the crushing loneliness of a system designed to control every aspect of their lives. It was a refusal to be anonymous, a refusal to be alone. And this custom is not just a rumor, it's documented in historical records. A scholar from the Han Dynasty named Yin Shao recorded that 对时 was when palace maids acted as husband and wife with each other. This was not just a convenient alliance. It was a conscious and formal imitation of the marriage that all of these women had been denied. Yin Shao added one more crucial detail that reveals the emotional intensity of these bonds. He noted that these couples were extremely jealous of each other. This jealousy speaks of a relationship that was expected to be exclusive and monogamous. It implied vows of fidelity, whether spoken or unspoken. This points to a deep, passionate, and sometimes possessive romantic bond. In a world where a palace maid owned nothing, her partner was the one person who was truly hers. So, was this marriage of sisters actually allowed? Unfortunately, the answer is a clear no. It was a complete violation of the palace's rigid order, a system that demanded every palace maid's devotion to be reserved for their masters and the emperor. This was a custom that thrived in the shadows, a vital part of the maid's private world, but a potential crime in the eyes of the court. To have your relationship discovered was to risk severe punishment. Because the act of 对时 had to be practiced in secret, there are not many recorded examples of these relationships. However, there is one famous story that survived. Not because their bond was celebrated, but because their secret was exposed during one of the biggest political scandals of their time. This is the tragic story of Cao Gong and Fáng. They were two small figures swept up in the political chaos that took down one of the most powerful women in the Han Dynasty, Empress Zhao Feiyan. But before their private life became public evidence, they were simply two women trying to survive. The story begins around 12 BCE, during the rule of Emperor Chen. We don't know for sure where they first met, but it could have been an imperial weaving workshop, where hundreds of women worked from dawn till dusk. The work was mind-numbing. The supervisors were cruel, and kindness was a weakness. Imagine that Fáng was the older of the two, a cynical survivor who had learned to keep her head down. And Cao Gong was the newcomer, still soft-edged and terrified. Perhaps their relationship began with a small act of protection. Maybe Fáng stepped in to defend Cao Gong from a supervisor's wrath. In the weeks and months that followed, their bond would have grown in stolen moments. A shared glance across the looms, a piece of fruit quietly passed from one hand to another in the dimmed light of the sleeping quarters. They started eating their meals together, face to face, creating a small island of trust in a sea of suspicion. There would have been no official ceremony for their partnership, no witness to their vow. It would have been a promise whispered in a deserted corner of the gardens one night, under the light of the moon, a simple pledge. From now on, you are my family. Eventually, they became a unit, a family of two. Their bond, a silent act of rebellion. But Cao Gong was overqualified to be a simple maid. While most maids in the palace were valued for their hands, she was valued for her mind. Her literacy and talent made her stand out, and she was promoted to a role of private secretary for Empress Zhao Feiyan. What should have been a happy promotion quickly took a dark turn. In her new role, she caught the eye of the emperor himself. This was now a tragic love triangle with the emperor at its center. Soon, Cao Gong was pregnant with the emperor's child. This was a direct threat to the childless Empress Zhao Feiyan, and the secret became a ticking time bomb. Cao Gong gave birth in secret to a healthy boy, hiding in the humble quarters of a cattle official, assisted by 6 other maids. But the secret couldn't be kept for long. When the empress found out, she flew into a hysterical rage, throwing herself on the floor and beating herself, accusing the emperor of betraying her. Under this intense emotional pressure, the emperor gave in and issued an imperial order. The order was delivered to a low-ranking prison official named Ji, commanding him to take Cao Gong and the baby and the 6 maids to the palace prison. Ji understood immediately what this meant. He was being ordered to dispose of the emperor's own son. He brought them to the prison, but then he hesitated. 3 days later, the palace eunuch Tian arrived to ask Ji, "Is the child dead yet?" Ji replied that the child was not dead yet. He tried to defend himself by proclaiming, "If I do not kill the child, I know I will die. But if I kill him, I will also die." In a moment of incredible courage, he asked Tian to send a message back to the emperor, pleading with him to remember that he had no heir. For a brief moment, there was hope. Tian told Ji that they have arranged for the child to be taken care of in secret in the palace, and the child was taken away. At this time, the child was 8 or 9 days old. Another 3 days later, Tian returned with a package for Cao Gong. Inside the package was a letter and poison. The letter read, "Do your best to drink this medicine. You cannot enter the palace again. You yourself know this." In great sorrow, Cao Gong cried. "It is as I expected. The empress and her sister want to control the empire. Where is my son now? His life is in danger. How can I let the Empress Dowager know to save him?" But sadly, nobody came to help, and Cao Gong was forced to drink the poison and died. Finally, the 6 maids who had assisted in the secret birth were given a horrific choice by the empress: commit suicide, or their families outside of the palace would be executed. Faced with an impossible choice, they were forced to take their own lives. But what about the infant prince? Was he safe? Historical records state that he was secretly cared for in the palace for 11 days, and then he was taken away and was never seen again. Ji kept his head down and was seemingly forgotten. For a while, it seemed this terrible crime was buried forever. Then, in the year 7 BCE, Emperor Chen was found dead. His death was sudden, suspicious, and he left no heir. Suspicion immediately fell upon Empress Zhao Feiyan. For years, Empress Zhao Feiyan and her sister had controlled the court with cruelty, using the emperor's favor. Now that the emperor was gone, her enemies struck back, accusing her and her sister of being responsible for the emperor's death. Empress Zhao Feiyan's rivals, led by the Empress Dowager Wang, launched a massive investigation into the emperor's mysterious death. The palace was thrown into chaos as investigators hunt for any crime to use against the Zhao clan. They found their star witness, the prison official Ji. For years, he had lived with the secret of what he had been forced to witness. Now, under interrogation, he recounted the entire horrifying story from years before. The secret birth, his failed plea, the disappearance of the infant prince, and the subsequent forced suicide of Cao Gong and her 6 maids. The cold case was finally brought to light. In the process, every secret of the empress's court was laid bare. The secret 对时 relationship between Cao Gong and Fáng was discovered. It was officially entered into the historical record, not as a loving relationship, but as evidence of the disorder and immorality of Empress Zhao Feiyan's court. We don't know what happened to her partner Fáng. Her fate is lost to history. Cao Gong is remembered, but not for her love or courage. She is just a name in a criminal investigation, a testament to a woman caught between her secret love for another maid, her tragic affair with an emperor, and the murderous jealousy of an empress. The sisterhood of 对时 was a powerful solution to the loneliness of the palace. But as the Han Dynasty wore on, the power dynamics of the inner court began to shift. The maids started to realize they weren't the only ones trapped in a lonely, isolated existence. There was another group living in a different kind of limbo, the Imperial eunuchs. They were not quite men, but not women, and they were forbidden from ever having a family of their own. Their lives were a strange mix of navigating deadly court politics and a quiet personal despair. So what happens when the loneliest people in the palace started to see each other not as servants or masters, but as fellow prisoners? They formed an alliance of mutual need. For a palace maid, constantly living in fear of a cruel supervisor or a rival's scheme, a eunuch partner could be a shield. He worked in the inner offices, he heard the gossip, he knew who was in favor and who was in trouble. He could offer her warnings, protection, and maybe even slip her an extra piece of fruit from a royal banquet. In a dangerous world of the palace, that kind of security was priceless. For the eunuch, the partnership offered something even more valuable, a home. It was the quiet comfort of having someone to talk to at the end of a long day. It was a shared glance across a courtyard that said, "I see you." It was the feeling of being a husband, of having a household, of building a small, private world that was just for the two of them. It was a way to feel whole in a life that was designed to be broken. And this wasn't just a rare arrangement. Towards the end of the Eastern Han Dynasty, as eunuchs gained more and more power, these partnerships became an open secret. Now, to be clear, this was still absolutely not allowed. Just like the maid-maid relationship, these partnerships were a violation of palace rules, and discovery could theoretically lead to severe punishment. But in the corrupt court of the late Eastern Han Dynasty, power was everything. A high-ranking eunuch could be more influential than a government minister. So as long as these relationships was kept reasonably discreet, most people, including the emperor, often just looked the other way. The official book of the Eastern Han confirms how common the practice became, stating plainly that powerful eunuchs would often take palace maids as their wives. The secret family of the palace had evolved. It was still an unsanctioned marriage, hidden from the official rules, but it was one that crossed the lines of the court's rigid social order. It was a partnership that was both a political strategy and a deeply human search for a family. The final and most complex form this secret world would take in the Han Dynasty. For a palace maid in the Han Dynasty, the future was a terrifying lottery. She might, through an incredible stroke of luck or a tragic accident, end up with her name in history books. Her life forever changed by a single encounter. But for the thousands of others, the only path forward was the one they carved out for themselves, with each other. These relationships weren't a strange footnote in history. They were a silent rebellion. They proved that no matter how high the walls are, or how rigid the rules, you can't engineer the fundamental human need for love, family, and connection out of people. It makes you wonder what really defines a family. Is it a name and a bloodline recognized by the state? Or is it simply a quiet promise between two people in the darkest of nights to face the world together? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed today's topic, don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you're curious about the life of a eunuch of the Han Dynasty, make sure you check out this video.
Stay curious, stay magical.